"Sir, I can heal your daughter," said the beggar boy. The black billionaire froze in shock. The morning air in Birmingham was sharp, biting softly, but enough to make every breath visible, a fleeting cloud of cold that vanished as quickly as it came. The kind of cold that made your fingertips sting and your face flush. Around the bustling entrance of the Children's Medical Center on 7th Avenue, people hurried in and out, wrapped in scarves and clutching hot coffee cups, as if moving faster might somehow outrun the invisible weight of worry that had brought them there. But among the flood of movement, one figure remained still, a young boy sitting quietly on a flattened cardboard box, his frame small and fragile against the roar of the world around him. His name was Ezekiel Carter, but everyone just called him Zeke. At 9 years old, he was both part of the street and apart from it. His coat hung loosely on his thin shoulders, the sleeves rolled up to reveal scrapes and bruises on his arms. His boots were patched with duct tape, a desperate attempt to keep them from falling apart. Zeke didn't beg. He didn't call out. He simply watched, eyes sharp and wide, observing the chaos of the hospital with a quiet intensity beyond his years. The red knit beanie pulled low over his forehead barely kept out the chill, but his gaze was unwavering. The notebook clutched in his hands was filled with sketches and scribbles, his world captured in pencil lines. Most people assumed he had family inside or was waiting for a ride, but Zeke was alone, always alone. Hospital staff had tried to move him on, but his calm demeanor and patient presence made them pause. Eventually, they stopped asking questions. Across the street, a dark silver Range Rover idled beside a fire hydrant, its engine humming softly. Inside sat Jonathan Reeves, a man in his late 40s. His face was marked by exhaustion, deep lines framing his sharp jaw, and his graying temples spoke of more worry than age. His tie was loose, collar wrinkled, a far cry from the polished businessman his suit suggested. In the back seat, cradled in a booster chair, was his daughter Isla. At 6 years old, her once bouncy brown curls were tucked neatly behind one ear. Her legs, however, were still hidden beneath a pink blanket, motionless and fragile. The accident had changed everything. One day she had been running, laughing, climbing trees like any child. The next, paralyzed from the waist down and silent, her eyes wide but empty of the joy Jonathan remembered. Jonathan stepped out carefully, lifting Isla in his arms, holding her like she might shatter with the slightest wrong move. His mind was a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and bleak prognoses, but his focus was on getting her inside the hospital, fighting to hold on to hope. He hadn't noticed Zeke at first. No one did, but Zeke had noticed him. The boy's eyes tracked Jonathan's every move, the tenderness in the father's arms, the way Isla's gaze stayed fixed on the sky instead of the looming hospital building. Then, just before Jonathan reached the revolving doors, a voice, soft but clear, cut through the noise. "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." Jonathan froze, mid-step. The words weren't shouted or pleaded. They weren't a joke or an empty promise. They were spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who truly believed them. Jonathan turned, narrowing his eyes, his protective arms still holding Isla tightly. "What did you say?" Zeke stood up slowly, clutching his notebook to his chest. "I said I can help her walk again." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "That's not funny, kid." Zeke's voice didn't waver. "I'm not joking." Jonathan looked him up and down, the patched boots, the oversized coat, the tired but unwavering eyes. It had to be some kind of scam. He turned abruptly, pushing the hospital doors open without another word, but Zeke's voice stayed with him. "I can help." Inside, the sterile corridors and clinical voices rang hollow to Jonathan's ears. Doctors spoke in measured tones, managing expectations, emphasizing long roads ahead, gently crushing hope under the weight of statistics. Yet, Zeke's simple declaration echoed in his mind like a stubborn refrain. By afternoon, Jonathan and Isla stepped back out into the cold, the sky breaking into a hesitant sun. Jonathan carried his daughter carefully toward the car when he noticed Zeke again, sitting quietly in his usual spot, waiting. "You again," Jonathan muttered as he approached, his voice heavy with fatigue and disbelief. "Why would you say something like that?" "You think this is a joke?" Zeke shook his head slowly. "No, sir. You don't even know her." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "You don't know what she's been through, what we've been through." Zeke didn't back down. "I don't have to know her to help." Jonathan straightened, frustration flaring. "You're what? 9? Almost 10? You're just a kid sitting outside a hospital in taped-up boots." "What could you possibly know about helping someone like my daughter?" Zeke's fingers traced the edge of his notebook as he spoke quietly. "My mama used to help people walk again. She was a physical therapist. She taught me stuff. She said the body remembers things, even when it forgets for a while." Jonathan's skepticism hardened. "So you watched her do stretches and now you think you're a doctor?" Zeke's eyes lifted, steady. "I watched her help a man walk after 5 years in a wheelchair. She didn't use machines or nurses, just her hands, her patience, and faith." Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but stopped as a nurse passed by and nodded at Zeke. Then a janitor gave a small wave in his direction. They all seemed to know him. "I'm not giving you money," Jonathan said abruptly. "I didn't ask for money," Zeke replied. "What do you want then?" Zeke took a breath and stepped forward. "Just 1 hour. Let me show you." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I should walk away." Zeke didn't move. "I should call security," Jonathan added, but still the boy stood silently. "Fine." "Waste your time, kid. Meet us at Harrington Park tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." Zeke nodded once. "I'll be there." Jonathan got into his SUV, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. But in his rearview mirror, Zeke remained standing there, hands at his sides, face unreadable, like a boy who had seen too much, but wasn't afraid. That night, Jonathan sat in his home office, papers strewn across his desk that suddenly made no sense. His thoughts were consumed by Zeke, the boy who claimed he could heal his daughter with just patience and simple techniques learned from his mother. "Daddy!" Isla's voice broke through his reverie. Jonathan looked up to see her standing at the doorway. "Who was that boy?" "Just somebody," he said softly. "Somebody we met outside the hospital." "But he said he could make me walk," Isla whispered, trailing her fingers over the armrest of her wheelchair like it was her own legs. Jonathan swallowed hard, feeling for the first time in months something unfamiliar, hope. Not naive hope, but a fragile spark that refused to die. Outside, Harrington Park was quiet. A cracked basketball court, rusty swings creaking softly, and a patch of grass barely holding its own as a soccer field. Most Sundays, the park was empty, but today, Zeke was already there, sitting on the bench beneath the old oak tree. His notebook was tucked away, replaced by a small gym bag and a neatly folded towel. At noon sharp, Jonathan pulled up in his SUV, carefully lifting Isla into her wheelchair. The air was crisp, but bright with promise. Zeke stood as they arrived, greeting them with a polite, "Hi again." Jonathan nodded stiffly, arms crossed defensively. Isla smiled shyly. "Hi, Zeke." Zeke smiled back warmly, a flicker of something almost like relief in his eyes. Jonathan glanced at the towel on the bench, skeptical. "So, what now?" "Magic carpet ride." Zeke ignored the jab, setting up his simple tools, a pair of socks, a tennis ball, a jar of cocoa butter, and a plastic container wrapped in cloth. "This is what my mom used," he explained. "The rice pack helps loosen tight muscles." "The ball works on pressure points." Jonathan folded his arms, still wary. "Can I work with your legs for a bit?" Zeke asked Isla gently. "If it hurts, just say stop." Isla looked at her dad, who sighed and gave a reluctant nod. "You can try, but be careful." Zeke knelt beside her wheelchair, unwrapping the warm rice pack and placing it on her thighs. Isla flinched slightly. "Too hot?" Zeke asked. "No," she whispered. Zeke nodded, beginning slow, gentle movements of her legs, careful not to push too hard. Jonathan watched, tension easing but still thick. "Ever done this before?" he asked. "My mama taught me," Zeke said softly. "She said the body doesn't always need fancy machines, just attention and care." Jonathan's skepticism softened, but he still kept watchful eyes. For the first time in months, a quiet calm settled between them, a fragile thread of hope woven through the crisp air of Harrington Park. The next morning dawned cold and grey, but the city had already begun its steady rhythm. Jonathan Reeves woke before sunrise, his mind tangled with worry and a strange thread of curiosity. Isla's room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the breathing machine that kept her steady through the night. He sat beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, feeling the weight of helplessness like a heavy cloak. Jonathan wasn't a man easily shaken by hope, especially after months of doctors' verdicts and therapists' cautious words. "Miracles take time," they said. "Management, not cure." Those words echoed in his head like a relentless drum. But something about Zeke's calm assurance gnawed at him, a tiny spark that refused to die. Later that day, Jonathan found himself drifting toward the park where he'd agreed to meet Zeke. Harrington Park was no grand place. The cracked basketball court, the rusting swings, and the tired old oak tree were a stark contrast to the polished hospital halls. Yet something about this place felt less cold, less clinical. It held a strange promise. Zeke was already there when Jonathan arrived. The boy sat on the bench, the same oversized jacket shielding him from the chill. His eyes lifted when Jonathan rolled Isla toward him, a small smile touching his lips. "Hi again," Zeke said quietly. Jonathan nodded, swallowing his skepticism. "Let's see what you've got." Isla's fingers clutched the armrests tightly, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She was fragile, broken in ways Jonathan couldn't fix with machines or medicine. But maybe, just maybe, this boy held something different. Zeke knelt beside Isla, unfolding the towel and placing the warm rice pack carefully on her thighs. "This helps loosen the muscles," he explained softly. "Heat wakes the body up." Isla flinched but didn't protest. Jonathan watched, arms crossed, his gaze sharp but guarded. Zeke's fingers moved gently, coaxing the muscles to remember what they had forgotten. "The body's memory is stronger than we think," he murmured. "Even when it's lost, it can find its way back." The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the grass, as Zeke guided Isla's legs through slow rotations, his touch careful and confident beyond his years. Isla's eyes flickered with effort, her toes twitching faintly. Jonathan cleared his throat. "You sure you know what you're doing, kid?" Zeke met his gaze without hesitation. "My mom helped people like this. She said the body just needs someone to listen." Jonathan wanted to believe him. He wanted to cling to any chance of healing, no matter how improbable. But years of disappointment had made him wary. Still, as the session went on, something subtle shifted. Isla's movements grew less stiff. Her breaths became steadier. The smallest flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "See that?" Zeke said softly. Progress. Jonathan nodded slowly, his heart pounding with cautious hope. Over the next few weeks, they returned to the park. Jonathan began to let down his walls, watching as Zeke's gentle persistence brought new life to Isla's legs. The boy's faith was contagious, a quiet defiance against despair. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Zeke unfolded a worn leather journal. "This is my mama's," he said. "She wrote down everything she learned about healing. I study it every day." Jonathan leaned closer, curious despite himself. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," Zeke whispered, eyes shining. "She told me that healing isn't just about the body. It's about hope, love, and believing when no one else does." Jonathan looked down at his daughter, watching her eyes follow Zeke's hands as they moved carefully over her legs. For the first time in a long time, he dared to believe. But as the weeks passed, the challenges grew. Isla's frustration mounted with each slow step, her patience stretched thin by setbacks and pain. Jonathan could see it in her eyes, the fight inside, the desperate wish to be whole again. One Sunday, Zeke arrived at the park to find Isla sitting silently, her face drawn and distant. Jonathan's jaw was tight, his usual reserve replaced by quiet worry. "She doesn't want to try today," Jonathan said softly. Zeke approached slowly. "What's wrong, Isa?" Isla's voice was barely a whisper. "I tried this morning." "Nothing, it's too hard." Zeke knelt beside her, his expression gentle. "I know it's hard." "I get tired too. I've seen people give up, but you're stronger than that." Tears welled in Isla's eyes. "I'm scared." Zeke placed a hand on her shoulder. "Being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you're close to something important." Jonathan watched, his own heart breaking and mending all at once. Together, they pushed through the fear and frustration. Each small victory was a beacon, each movement a step toward hope. And through it all, Zeke remained a steady presence, a boy who carried the weight of loss and the light of possibility. As the sun set over Harrington Park, the quiet determination in their hearts was louder than any doubt. This was just the beginning. The following Sunday morning, the cold bite in the air was softened by the weak warmth of the early sun. Harrington Park looked the same as it always did. A cracked basketball court, a few benches, and the familiar worn-out oak tree standing tall like a silent guardian. But today, the park held a different energy, an undercurrent of anticipation that Jonathan couldn't quite explain. He arrived early, pushing Isla's wheelchair toward the bench where Zeke was already waiting. The boy sat calmly, his duct-taped boots resting on the dusty ground, a neatly folded towel, and his small gym bag at his side. There was something steady about Zeke, something beyond his years that gave Jonathan a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in months. "Morning," Zeke greeted softly, looking up with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of stories untold. Jonathan nodded. "Morning." Isla, bundled under a blanket, barely stirred. Her tired eyes barely met Zeke's. Jonathan sighed and lowered her onto the bench next to Zeke. He watched, arms crossed, skepticism still clinging to his features but softened by curiosity. Zeke began unpacking his small arsenal, a tennis ball, warm rice packs wrapped in cloth, cocoa butter, and a pair of socks. He worked quietly, gently removing Isla's blanket and revealing the tightly wrapped bandages around her legs. "Ready?" Zeke asked softly. Isla gave a faint nod. Zeke carefully pressed the warm rice packs against her thighs, his touch light and reassuring. Jonathan's heart pounded as he watched Isla flinch, then relax. "Feels good?" Zeke asked. She nodded slowly, eyes closed. The boy started moving her legs in slow, deliberate rotations, careful not to cause pain, but focused on waking muscles that hadn't moved in months. Jonathan found himself holding his breath, his body tense with the fear that any moment something could go wrong. "Ever done this before?" he asked, voice low. Zeke looked up, meeting Jonathan's gaze without hesitation. "My mama was a physical therapist. She taught me all this." Said the body remembers, even when it seems broken. Jonathan wanted to scoff, to dismiss the boy's words as wishful thinking, but the tenderness in Zeke's touch and the calm certainty in his voice gnawed at his doubts. "You watched her do this?" Jonathan pressed. "More than watched," Zeke said quietly. "I helped." Jonathan looked away, the weight of his own helplessness crashing down on him. How could this kid know more about healing than the doctors and specialists who had been trying for months? Minutes passed in tense silence as Zeke worked, coaxing Isla's legs to remember their strength. "Can you feel this?" Zeke tapped gently behind her knees. Isla's lips parted slightly. "Yes." Jonathan's eyes widened. He hadn't heard her speak like that in weeks. Zeke smiled but said nothing. He just kept moving her legs, speaking softly to her, telling her stories about colors and music, anything to keep her mind from focusing on the pain. Slowly, Isla's legs twitched. Jonathan's chest tightened with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Zeke straightened up. "We try again next week." Jonathan nodded, voice thick. "Thank you." Isla looked up at Zeke, her eyes shining with something new. "Thank you." After the session, as they packed up, Jonathan found himself opening up in a way he hadn't before. "Zeke, why do you do this? Why help someone you don't know?" Zeke shrugged, his usual quiet self. "Because I remember what it felt like to be helpless. My mom helped people like Isa. She made them believe." Jonathan looked at the boy, trying to grasp the depth of his determination. "You ever think about doing something else? Something easier?" Zeke shook his head. "No." "This feels right." That night, Jonathan sat alone in his dimly lit office, staring at papers and contracts that suddenly felt meaningless. His mind replayed the day's events. The flicker of movement in Ila's legs, the boy's unwavering faith. He opened his laptop and typed, "Ezekiel Carter Birmingham," hoping to find more about this mysterious kid who had become a beacon of hope. There was little information, just some old news about a girl named Monique Carter and a community clinic. Jonathan leaned back, a strange mix of frustration and awe filling him. This boy was a ghost, yet somehow the brightest light he'd seen in a long time. He closed the laptop and whispered to the quiet room, "Who are you, Zeke?" Outside, under the stars, the boy sat on the same bench, his eyes closed, hands folded over his notebook. He wasn't just a kid. He was a promise, a chance, and Jonathan knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The following week dawned cold and grey, the kind of day that seemed to drain the warmth from the air and leave behind a biting chill. Yet despite the harsh weather, Jonathan found himself looking forward to his Sunday routine more than ever. The small moments of hope, sparked by Zeke's persistence and Isla's tiny victories, were already reshaping the dull landscape of his heart. He arrived at Harrington Park earlier than usual, the familiar hum of the city muffled beneath the heavy clouds. Isla was quieter this time, her eyes heavy with fatigue, but she didn't complain. Jonathan could feel her resignation, the invisible weight pressing on her tiny frame, a weight he desperately wanted to lift. Zeke was waiting near the old oak tree, as always. His oversized jacket looked almost comical against his slender frame, and the duct tape on his boots seemed a permanent badge of his resilience. But his eyes, those sharp, clear eyes, held a depth that belied his age. When he saw Jonathan and Isla approaching, a rare, soft smile flickered across his face. "Hey, Isa," Zeke greeted quietly. Isla returned the smile, though faint, and the brief exchange carried a warmth that defied the cold. Jonathan didn't say much. He helped Isla out of the SUV, his hands steady but his heart racing. The doctor's reports, the therapist's updates, it was all a blur compared to the quiet strength of this boy who had somehow stolen his hope. Zeke laid out his towel and unpacked his modest tools, the rice packs, tennis balls, and a small jar of cocoa butter. He worked with the same calm focus, his hands gentle as he began warming Isla's legs. Jonathan watched, barely breathing, as Zeke slowly moved her legs through the familiar stretches. Isla's brow furrowed, eyes clenched tight in concentration, muscles twitching in a dance between pain and possibility. "Can you press your heel down?" Zeke asked softly. Isla's lips parted, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might say no. Then, almost imperceptibly, her foot flexed, just the tiniest movement, but a movement nonetheless. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. "That's it," Zeke whispered, his voice steady but filled with quiet triumph. "Your body remembers, Issa. It just needs you to listen." Jonathan knelt beside them, the wall of skepticism beginning to crumble. He saw something new in Isla's eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. But the day wasn't without its struggles. As they continued, Issa's frustration bubbled to the surface. "It's too hard," she whispered at one point, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm tired, Zeke. Maybe this isn't going to work." Zeke paused, looking deeply into her face. "I get it," he said softly. "I've been there too, watching my mom get sicker, feeling powerless, but giving up now would mean giving up on something real." Jonathan's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of every doubt, every fear his daughter carried. Yet here was a boy, younger than Isla, who understood more than any doctor or therapist ever had. "Sometimes being scared means you're close," Zeke added gently. "Close to breaking through." Isla wiped her tears, nodding slowly. Jonathan found his voice. "We're going to keep going. Together." Over the next hour, they pushed through the pain and frustration. Zeke guided Isla's legs with patient, deliberate care, coaxing movement out of muscles long dormant. Jonathan lent steady support, physically and emotionally, offering words of encouragement and steady hands when needed. By the end of the session, Isla managed a shaky step, a small, trembling motion that made Jonathan's heart soar. "You did it," he whispered, tears threatening to spill. Isla's smile was radiant despite the exhaustion. "We did it," she said, looking at Zeke. Zeke only nodded, the rare smile tugging at his lips. But just as hope began to bloom, the harsh reality seeped back in. Later that evening, Jonathan sat alone, staring at the untouched papers on his desk. The weight of the day pressed down on him, mingled with a deep unease. Who was this boy, really? How could someone so young, so seemingly fragile, wield such power over his daughter's body and spirit? He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages and emails, distracted by the noise of a world that suddenly felt distant. Then, the call came. It was a voice he hadn't expected, a voice from the past, laden with threat and warning. "Jonathan," the caller said coldly, "you're playing a dangerous game. Don't forget who you're dealing with." Jonathan's hand trembled as he ended the call. The lines between hope and danger blurred. The mysterious past Zeke carried wasn't just a shadow, it was a storm gathering on the horizon. But Jonathan knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to let fear win. Not when Isla's steps were just beginning to find their rhythm. He looked out the window at the darkening sky, feeling the weight of the unknown ahead. Yet beneath it all, a fierce determination burned. They were in this together, no matter what it took. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan dared to believe in the impossible. The chill in the air hadn't lessened by the time Sunday arrived again, but there was an unmistakable electricity buzzing beneath the cold. Jonathan's mind was a whirlwind of hope and caution as he buckled Isla into her wheelchair and drove toward Harrington Park. This was no ordinary day, not when a spark of movement had started flickering in his daughter's legs. When they pulled into the park, the familiar oak tree cast long shadows on the cracked basketball court. Zeke was already there, sitting quietly on the bench with his usual oversized jacket and the patched boots that told their own story of hardship. But today, there was a purposeful energy about him. Jonathan helped Isla out of the car, noticing her quiet anticipation. For the first time in months, he saw a hint of eagerness in her eyes, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. Zeke rose as they approached. "Hey, Issa," he said with a warm smile. Isla gave a small but genuine smile back. Jonathan noticed how Zeke moved differently today, more confident, more in command of his mission. It was as if something inside the boy had been quietly gathering strength, ready to break free. Without wasting a moment, Zeke laid out his towel and unpacked the rice packs, tennis balls, and a small jar of cocoa butter. He worked with the same gentle precision, warming Isla's legs and moving them through stretches with a patience that was almost spiritual. Jonathan crouched nearby, arms crossed, but eyes wide, soaking in every detail. The therapists and doctors had been right in many ways. Progress was slow, and the road ahead long. But Zeke's methods, unconventional as they were starting to show a different kind of promise. Isla's brow furrowed in concentration as Zeke encouraged her to press her heels against the ground, flex her toes, wiggle her feet. At first, the movements were faint, mere flickers of muscle memory, but with every session the flickers grew stronger. "You're doing great," Zeke told her quietly. "Remember, the body never forgets. It just needs a little reminder." Jonathan found himself relaxing, the walls of doubt beginning to crumble. He watched as Isla's face lit up with the tiniest victories. A twitch, a shift, a smile sparked by accomplishment. The magic was in the details, and for once, the impossible seemed just within reach. But the day was not without its challenges. Midway through the session, Isla's frustration became palpable. "I'm tired," she said softly, the weight of months of struggle pressing down on her young shoulders. "Maybe this won't work. Maybe I'll never walk again." Jonathan's heart clenched. The sight of his daughter's defeat was a blow harder than any diagnosis. Zeke knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "I get it. Sometimes the hardest part isn't moving your legs, it's moving your heart. But if you stop now, you'll never know how far you can go." Isla looked up at him, tears threatening to spill. "I'm scared," she admitted. Jonathan swallowed hard, his own fears rising to the surface. But Zeke met her gaze steadily. "Being scared means you're close." "Close to breaking through." Isla wiped her eyes and nodded, a flicker of determination returning. As the session progressed, Zeke guided her through exercises with renewed focus. Jonathan stood behind them, offering steady support and encouragement, his own hope rekindled. Then, just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, it happened. Isla's foot slid forward, an unsteady, trembling movement, but unmistakably her own. Jonathan gasped, dropping to his knees beside her. "You did it," he whispered, disbelief and joy mingling in his voice. Isla's eyes widened, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I did it," she whispered back. Zeke's lips curled into a rare, proud smile. "You're stronger than you think." The crowd of onlookers, parents, children, therapists, watched in stunned silence before breaking into applause. It was a moment of pure, raw triumph. But as the celebrations unfolded, Jonathan's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his smile fading as he read the message that made his blood run cold. "Stay away." "We're watching." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather swept over him. For all the hope in the park, the shadows of danger were closing in. Jonathan looked at Zeke, whose expression remained calm but resolute. "We're not done yet," Zeke said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Jonathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The fight for Isla's future was no longer just a personal battle. It had become a war for truth, hope, and justice, and together they would face it head-on. The next few days after that stunning breakthrough were a whirlwind of cautious hope and guarded excitement. Jonathan and Isla returned to Harrington Park every Sunday, accompanied by Zeke and a growing crowd of families whose lives had begun to touch theirs. Word was spreading about the boy with taped boots who was changing the impossible into reality. But the danger Jonathan had sensed lingered, casting long shadows over every smile. Jonathan sat on a worn bench near the oak tree, watching Isla stretch her legs under Zeke's careful guidance. The boy's hands moved with an assuredness that belied his age, adjusting, pressing, encouraging. Isla's eyes were fierce with determination today, her brow furrowed in concentration as she fought against the limits her body had imposed. "You're doing better than last week," Zeke said softly, moving a warm rice pack from her thighs to her calves. "Remember, healing isn't just physical. It's in the mind, too." Jonathan nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Ever since the cryptic message warning him to stay away, he'd been on edge, watching over his daughter like a hawk. Who was watching? What did they want? And why now? Just when hope had returned. The hospital had been a fortress for months, a place of sterile white walls and whispered diagnoses. But here, surrounded by trees and the soft murmur of city life, a different kind of healing was taking place. Jonathan was grateful for Zeke's presence, even if he was still struggling to fully trust the boy. "Dad?" Isla said suddenly, breaking through his thoughts. She tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide. "Zeke says I'm going to walk again. Do you believe him?" Jonathan looked down at her, trying to meet her hopeful gaze. "I believe in you, Isa." "That's what matters most." Zeke looked up and caught Jonathan's eye. "It's not just about belief, Mr. Reeves. The body remembers, but sometimes it needs a little push, a little love to find its way back." As the session ended, Jonathan packed up the supplies while Isla rested quietly. Zeke's quiet confidence was infectious, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. Later that evening, as Jonathan scrolled through his phone, an alert popped up. It was an anonymous tip about a corporate rival who had been quietly pressuring Jonathan's company to drop support for Isla's care. The message was clear. "Stop meddling, or there will be consequences." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter's legs anymore, he was fighting for their very future. He called Zeke, asking if he could come over, needing to talk about what was unfolding. When Zeke arrived, Jonathan explained the threat, expecting fear or hesitation. But instead, Zeke's eyes shone with fierce resolve. "People like us," Zeke said quietly. "We don't back down, not when there's hope on the line." Days turned into weeks, and the sessions grew in intensity. Isla's movements became smoother, her steps longer. Yet, the tension in Jonathan's world escalated. Anonymous calls, subtle threats, and the shadow of powerful adversaries loomed. One afternoon, as Zeke guided Isla through a particularly challenging stretch, a black SUV pulled up near the park. Men in suits stepped out, scanning the area. Jonathan stiffened, instinctively moving to shield Isla. Zeke didn't flinch. "They're here," he said calmly. "But we've come too far to stop now." Jonathan glanced at the approaching men, their faces hard, eyes cold. "What do they want?" "To stop the truth from coming out," Zeke replied. As the men approached, Jonathan stood, positioning himself between them and his daughter. "She's healing," he said firmly. "Nothing you do will change that." One of the men sneered. "You're meddling in things beyond your control, Reeves. Drop this, or you'll regret it." Jonathan met his gaze. "I'll take my chances." The confrontation escalated, drawing the attention of other park visitors. But before anything could turn violent, a voice interrupted. "Enough!" From behind the crowd stepped a woman, tall, dignified, with an air of authority that silenced the tension instantly. She wore a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "I'm Detective Harper," she announced. "I've been monitoring this situation. Any threats against these families will not be tolerated." Jonathan exhaled, relief washing over him. The battle lines were clear, but now they had an unexpected ally. In the following days, the investigation uncovered a web of corporate sabotage aimed at discrediting Isla's progress and halting Jonathan's efforts. Zeke, too, was pulled into the spotlight. His past, his mysterious knowledge of healing, and his resilience becoming a beacon of hope for many. Yet, despite the challenges, the bond between Jonathan, Isla, and Zeke grew stronger. Their story inspired others, families who had given up hope, children who found courage, communities rallying for justice. One evening, after a particularly successful session where Isla took several unassisted steps, Jonathan looked at Zeke with profound gratitude. "You changed our lives, kid. More than you know." Zeke shrugged, a humble smile on his face. "I'm just paying it forward." As night fell, Jonathan stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with obstacles and battles yet to come. But in his heart, he knew one truth. Hope, fueled by courage and kindness, was a force no darkness could ever extinguish. And together, they would walk through it all, step by step, one miracle at a time. The following weeks marked a turning point, one that tested the strength of the fragile hope Jonathan, Isla, and Zeke had built together. With each session at Harrington Park, Isla's steps grew steadier, her confidence blossoming like the spring flowers pushing through cracked concrete. But outside that peaceful bubble, the forces aligned against them tightened their grip. Jonathan could feel it every time he stepped into his office. Subtle, cold shoulders from colleagues, phone calls dropped mid-conversation, veiled threats disguised as business advice. He knew the corporate rivals didn't want Isla to get better, not because they were cruel, but because her progress challenged their interests and questioned their control. Zeke, however, remained unshaken. The boy's quiet determination burned brighter than ever. "They can try to stop us," Zeke told Jonathan one afternoon as they packed up after a session. "But hope is harder to kill than money." Jonathan appreciated the boy's optimism, but the weight on his shoulders was heavier than ever. His daughter's health, his company's future, and now protecting Zeke, who, despite his young age, had become a symbol of resistance, were all intertwined in a battle far bigger than any of them had expected. That Sunday, Harrington Park was filled with a buzz of excitement. Word had spread about Isla's incredible progress, and more families with children facing disabilities came to watch, to learn, to believe. Zeke moved from group to group, demonstrating techniques, offering encouragement with a maturity beyond his years. Jonathan sat near the oak tree, his eyes following Isla's every movement, pride swelling in his chest. Yet, lurking at the edges of the crowd, a familiar tension hung in the air. Men in dark suits, the corporate enforcers, watched silently, their expressions unreadable but menacing. Suddenly, Zeke paused mid-demonstration and glanced toward the tree line. His eyes narrowed. They're back. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. The two men approached, their steps deliberate, confidence bordering on arrogance. One of them, tall and sharply dressed, called out, "Mr. Reeves, a word please." Jonathan rose slowly, positioning himself between the men and the families. "I'm busy right now," he said firmly. The man smirked. "I'm afraid you're not aware of the consequences if you continue on this path." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We're not going anywhere." The standoff drew the attention of the crowd, murmurs rippling through the families who had come to witness a miracle in progress. Parents whispered fears, hope mingling with anxiety. Zeke stepped forward, his small frame casting a surprisingly large shadow. "You want to stop this? You'll have to go through me first." The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Kid, you don't know who you're messing with." But before the situation could escalate, a firm voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Detective Harper appeared, flanked by officers. "You're harassing a family and interfering with a lawful gathering." "Step back." The men hesitated, glancing at each other, then reluctantly retreated, their faces burning with frustration. Jonathan exhaled, relief mingling with anger. "Thank you," he said to Harper. She nodded. "This isn't just about threats or intimidation. There's a whole network working to undermine families like yours." "We're building a case." Zeke watched the exchange silently, then looked up at Jonathan. "We're making them nervous." Jonathan smiled grimly. "Good. We'll take that as a win." In the days that followed, the support for Isla and Zeke grew exponentially. Donations poured in, local businesses offered space for physical therapy classes, and volunteers arrived, inspired by the boy with the taped boots, who was rewriting what was possible. Isla's progress became a beacon of hope, not just for families in Birmingham, but for communities beyond. Yet with every small victory came new challenges. Zeke's past remained a mystery to many, and whispers circulated about the true extent of his abilities. Some questioned if it was luck, others suspected something more. Jonathan found himself fielding calls from media outlets and medical professionals, his protective instincts clashing with the desire to share their story. One evening, as Jonathan and Zeke packed up after a long session, a journalist approached. "Zeke, your story is inspiring." "How do you do it? What drives you?" Zeke looked up, eyes steady. "I'm not doing it alone. It's about people believing in each other. Healing isn't magic. It's love, patience, and a lot of hard work." The journalist smiled. "That's a story people need to hear." Meanwhile, the corporate enemies regrouped, their tactics becoming more insidious. Attempts were made to discredit Jonathan's company. Misinformation spread about Isla's condition, and pressure mounted on those close to the family. Jonathan faced board meetings filled with veiled ultimatums, legal threats, and the ever-present shadow of financial ruin. But every time he wavered, he thought of Isla's laughter as she took her first steps, of Zeke's unwavering courage, and the community that had rallied around them. The climax came one chilly autumn afternoon. As Isla practiced walking with Zeke and Jonathan, a sudden confrontation erupted outside the park. A group of men confronted the families, shouting slurs and threats, attempting to intimidate them into silence. Jonathan, Zeke, and the families stood their ground, forming a united front. Detective Harper arrived swiftly, backing the families with law enforcement. The hostile group was dispersed, and arrests followed. The aftermath was a turning point. The community galvanized, organizing fundraisers, advocacy campaigns, and pushing for legal reforms to protect vulnerable families from harassment. Jonathan addressed a crowd at a local town hall meeting. "This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every person who's been told they're less than, who's been pushed to the margins. Together, we can change that narrative." Zeke, standing beside him, nodded. Strength comes from standing up, even when it's hard. We're all in this together. The story ended not with a final victory, but with a promise of resilience, community, and the power of hope. Jonathan looked at Zeke one evening. "You've changed more lives than you know." Zeke smiled. "I'm just getting started." And as the city lights shimmered in the distance, a new chapter began, not just for Isla or Zeke, but for everyone willing to believe that healing, in all its forms, is possible. The crisp autumn air hung thick with anticipation as the crowd gathered at the community center for the town hall meeting. The room was packed, faces of all ages, colors, and walks of life, united by a shared sense of purpose. Jonathan stood near the podium, Isla in her wheelchair beside him, her eyes bright with hope and determination. Zeke, the quiet force behind this movement, sat nearby, his usual reserved demeanor softened by the support radiating from the room. Jonathan's voice echoed through the hall as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just my fight. It's everyone's fight. Every person who's ever been told no, pushed aside, or made to feel less because of who they are or the challenges they face." Isla's journey, our journey, shows that healing is possible, but it takes more than medicine and machines. It takes community, courage, and compassion. The applause was thunderous, but beneath the celebration was a deep, raw truth. Change was never easy, and the path forward would be fraught with obstacles. Later, behind the scenes, Jonathan met with city officials and advocates. The evidence of harassment, intimidation, and systemic bias was undeniable. Thanks to Detective Harper's meticulous work and the public's outcry, an inquiry was launched to investigate the corporate tactics used to suppress families like theirs. But the opposition was relentless. Powerful interests tried to discredit the movement, planting stories and stirring doubt. At one point, Jonathan received an anonymous threat warning him to back down. Instead of fear, it steeled his resolve. "They're scared," he told Zeke. "That means we're doing something right." Zeke, now a recognized figure in the city, felt the weight of expectations but never let it break his spirit. One evening, while helping Isla with her exercises, he looked up and said, "I'm just a kid who wants to help people walk again. I don't need fame or fortune. I just want to see more smiles like Issa's." Isla smiled back. "You gave me my legs, Zeke." "You gave me my life back." Months passed, and the community center became a hub of healing and education. Zeke helped train volunteers, sharing the simple techniques his mother taught him. Jonathan worked tirelessly to ensure that policies changed, advocating for accessible healthcare and support for families with disabled children. In the midst of progress, the corporate enemies faced consequences. Board members resigned amid scandal, lawsuits were filed, and the public demanded transparency. Some lost their licenses, others were publicly shamed. The city instituted protections to prevent harassment and discrimination against vulnerable families. At a quiet moment, Jonathan stood beside Zeke outside the community center. "You changed everything," he said softly. Zeke shrugged, eyes focused on the horizon. "We all have the power to change something. Sometimes, it just takes one person who believes." As the sun dipped below the skyline, Isla took a few unsteady steps on her own, laughter bubbling from her lips. Jonathan's eyes welled with tears of pride, hope, and the promise of a future rewritten. This story is a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can ignite the most profound transformations. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And that true healing comes not just from medicine, but from heart, hope, and humanity. If this story touched you, share it. Let it inspire others to believe in the impossible. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one act, to change a life. and maybe even the world. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate resilience and hope. Together we can make a difference.